Thank you so much. So I'll go ahead and get started. The title of my talk is Evaluating Sources and Navigating Through Bias. And first, I'd like to take a minute to introduce myself a little bit more. I'm a librarian at Syracuse University. That's a picture of Bird Library behind me and on the screen. I'm talking to you from the 5th floor of a not nighttime Syracuse campus, but it's a lovely spring day, just like I'm assuming it is here in New York. So while my title says librarian, I consider myself a teacher and an information literacy advocate. I love working with students and staff and faculty to help them develop the skills and habits of mind that enable them to be successful creators of information. Before I came to Syracuse, I worked for the New York Public Library at the Seward Park branch, and then I moved over to what was then called NYPL Express, where I performed reference for a variety of research clients. So the New York library community is near and dear to my heart. I'm also a dog mom, and I love sharing photos of her. This is a picture of me and Emma. And finally, I am obsessed with pizza, so I find that that's something I'm willing to talk with anybody about. And I'm also a really big Buffalo Bills fan. For anybody who likes football, you know that we've been through a lot, and last year was particularly wonderful, and I'm hoping for a big year to come. So my overall goal for this session is to think through how bias impacts the way that we search for, evaluate, and use information. And more specifically, I want to spend some time looking at how our own personal biases are tied up in that search process. I then want to discuss some of the evaluative methods that are really helpful in uncovering bias that exists in individual sources. And then finally, I'd like to shine a light on some of the bias that is inherent in the information systems that we use to search for information. After each section, I'm going to pose a question for you to reflect on. You don't need to answer it right away, but I thought it would set us up for a good discussion afterwards. So we need to examine our context for this talk first. In thinking through the bias that we find in information searching, I believe we first need to acknowledge our own positionality within the search process, right? So as library professionals, we are charged with helping patrons to search, right? But we're also our own independent searchers. So as staff, it's our jobs to educate our patrons on how to use tools and techniques to discover and combat bias with information resources and systems. But as our own independent searchers, we need to acknowledge that we come with our own personal biases, and that plays a role in how we search. And I think intentionally accepting this as a fact and reckoning with it will allow us to serve our patrons better. So in order to examine our own personal biases, I want to first take a moment to share that the bias that I'm referring to exists within all of us. Okay, I'm not here to blame or pass judgment. I'm rather here to bring to the surface these biases so that we can be aware of them. Okay, and while these cognitive biases exist in multiple contexts, let's think today about how these biases really impact us when we're in the information search process. So that's kind of where I'm going with that. So a definition of cognitive bias we have on our slide is that cognitive biases are often a result of your brain's attempt to simplify information processing. A cognitive bias refers to the subconscious decisions we make when we search for, process, and interpret information. That's kind of an umbrella term. So these biases don't really make an impact if you think about your casual searching, like looking up movie times or the weather. For instance, we might pick the first result we get, or we might need to consult just one particular source. And we don't usually need to vet this information for reliability or trust, right? But when we're doing research or helping others do research that's more in depth, these biases can have an impact. And next, I'm going to share some of the 3 common types of cognitive bias that come up when searching, and I'm going to share some strategies to mitigate them. So the first one we have here is confirmation bias. And the definition here reads that confirmation bias is the tendency to selectively search for or interpret information in a way that confirms your previously held beliefs or hypotheses. So the Venn diagram that we're looking at on this slide shows an intersection between the information that is retrieved in a search. So, I mean, it could be a Google search, a library catalog search, and then our own beliefs, right? And then the confirmation bias occurs when we value only those sources that are overlapping, right? So an example of that is maybe you're doing a research paper and you want to search on, whether meat is good or bad for you. If you do a search in Google and you could search on the term meat is good for you, You could also search on the term meat is bad for you, and what you're going to get are results that confirm that bias, right? So if you're searching for results that say meat is good for you, you're going to get results that say meat is good for you. And if you search on the other side, you're going to get the same set of results. So that's kind of a problem that comes up in searching. And so that means that we have to consciously think about shifting the way that we search for information. So like a different approach you could take in this instance is to not use terms that imply something to already be fact, or use terms that kind of are weighted on one side or the other. So maybe more neutral terms like meat and health, or meat and nutrition, right? So that could be something that will get you some results that are not necessarily neutral, but don't immediately play into that confirmation bias that our brain naturally wants to jump to, right? So that's one. Another one, and this one is very common for, I see this a lot with our undergraduate students at Syracuse University, and that's availability bias. This is the tendency to rely on the first example that comes to mind, or the most recent or readily available information. This can be like students have papers to do, and the paper is due tomorrow morning, and they decide to start their research tonight at midnight, right? And so availability bias is going to definitely come into play when you're in a hurry. So it's convenience is a part of it. You're going to get a lot of information, right? But then maybe you only read the title, and you kind of just accept that title as, okay, this is going to be good enough for me. I see this happen a lot when students are asked to find a certain number of sources. Maybe they have to find 5 books in the library, and so they do a search in a library catalog, and they take the first 5 books that really kind of fit their search terms. This is availability bias, and this is something that we want to try and combat as well. So a way to do that is to encourage folks to go beyond the top results. I mean, I don't know how many times I have to mention to my students, scroll down, go to the next page, keep looking, right? The top stuff isn't necessarily the best stuff, right? And then be critical of your personal opinions and how it's affected by what you have most recently read. And a good idea is to just start over and change your search terms, or to do multiple searches, right? And again, this kind of also goes to more, it's not necessarily a skill that we develop, but it's kind of a habit of mind that research itself is a messy process. Research takes time. So if we understand that easy answers aren't always going to be there, then maybe that will help combat this availability bias. The third bias that I wanted to talk about is in-group bias, and it's the tendency to select sources that are in line with your own identity. And if you remember, I said at the beginning of our talk that I was a huge Buffalo Bills fan, and I certainly have an in-group bias when it comes to talking about all things football. I don't care what anybody who is a Patriots fan has to say, but clearly that is not a wise or effective way of searching for information, right? So examples of in-group bias in searching could be seen when maybe you want to catch up on some recent news, and you only consider news sources that match with your political identity. As a librarian working with patrons, we might be overly quick to recommend certain databases that we use often, even though they may not be the best source. And in my work in higher education, I sometimes see in-group bias in our faculty who only want students to use information that is scholarly, when there might be a justification to look outside that community for information. So some ways to mitigate in-group bias are to practice inclusive searching techniques, like trying a wide variety of keyword searches and not relying solely on subject headings, which I'm going to get to the complications of those in a little bit. You can be intentional in examining the authors of your sources. Are you only relying on one group, or one group that is a group that you're comfortable with, right? Look for diverse voices in the sources that you choose. On this slide, I have just 3 bulleted points of some really great websites that you can go to. Women Also Know Stuff, People of Color Also Know Stuff, Cite Black Authors. That's just a little snippet of places where you can search for scholarly literature or expertise in areas that are not dominantly held as authorities, right? They're not the dominant perspective. And this is just a very small snippet of a strategy that you might employ. So that's the cognitive piece. And so I just wanted to pause here and let you all take some time to reflect on this question. Do you recognize any of these biases in your own search habits? Okay, so now that we've spent some time considering how cognitive bias can impact our search behaviors, let's look at the ways we can look for bias within information sources themselves. If any of you in the audience have taught information literacy or helped your patrons or students to find and use information, you understand that evaluating sources is something we've been doing for a really long time. We're really good at it. This image right here is kind of just your basic framework for what kinds of questions you need to ask when you're evaluating sources. You know, is it credible, relevant, current, accurate? Is it a reasonable source? Can you rely on it? Is it objective or not? You know, so these are just some guiding questions that a lot of evaluating sources methods have been built upon, right? So what I want to talk about is certain kinds of methods that are out there and kind of a little bit about how there's some methods that have evolved in the past, 5 years or so to really get at bias, to really acknowledge that. So the traditional model that we have is the CRAAP test, and this may be very familiar to some of you. You may have learned it in high school or even in middle school. I know it's taught in secondary schools, and it entered the mainstream in 2004. It was created by a librarian, and it was a way to kind of address the, increasing reliance on web resources in the early 2000s, right? And so it was geared towards websites. It's a checklist style of a methodology. You have students or users just go through this list of questions, and it has a nice, easy to remember acronym: currency, relevance, authority, accuracy, and purpose, right? And we've used that for almost 20 years now, and it's been effective. But as information professionals, librarians have started to really think through this test, we're starting to see that it has some issues, right? And so some of the criticisms with the CRAAP test is that this checklist style requires a student to stay on the source that they're evaluating, right? So it requires you to just kind of, at the very beginning, just give this source, I guess, not acknowledge that this source is interacting with other sources, right? So you don't leave the source to check things, to find out more information about the author, to see if this source has been cited elsewhere, to see who is behind the publication of this source, right? It wasn't originally designed for the social web that we find ourselves in, where an information source could start with a tweet, or conversely, a scholarly article could lead to a popular article that could then be, misinterpreted or taken out of context, right? And so the CRAAP test is useful, but over time, some new methods have come into play, and I just wanted to share with you a couple of those. So this is a method, I don't know if many of you have heard about this, but it's called the if I apply method. And I learned about this in 2017, I believe, but it was introduced in 2016 by some librarians from Marshall and Penn State universities. And they created it in a way to address the post-truth world that we find ourselves in. Obviously, it was right after the 2016 election. They had been trying to teach students how to evaluate sources, and they really recognized that the topics that students in their classes were researching were emotionally charged, and that they felt it was really important that that be acknowledged, and that students take the time to recognize the kinds of bias that they might come into the classroom with, and consider how that might impact the way that they search for and engage with information. And so they created this method that starts with 3 personal steps. So the I is identify emotions attached to a topic. Find unbiased reference sources. So asking students to just, can you just consult an encyclopedia, right? And then also asking students to have intellectual courage to seek authoritative voices on a topic that might be outside of their thesis, outside of their opinion, right? And so just kind of really taking this step to do some personal work and look at your own implicit biases, your own explicit biases, and think about how that might impact the way that you search for information. So that's kind of why I like this method. And I will tell you that if anybody in the audience is looking to apply it in an instructional setting, it takes some time. So that's kind of why I haven't been able to implement it in my work as a librarian. I generally get to work with students in a one-off session. So this is something that takes more than one session. The next method that you may have heard about is the ACT UP method, and I really love this method. It was introduced in 2017 by Don Stahura out of Simmons College. And she's a librarian who, like me, was charged with teaching undergraduate students how to evaluate sources and coming up to these roadblocks where students just were not questioning sources. They were kind of just taking information sources for granted and assuming things about them that they might not be true, and also just not digging deep enough, and also not acknowledging that there's bias inherent in information sources, right? There can be bias in the content, but there's bias in the creator of the information, there's bias in the platform, there's bias in the publisher who's paying for the source. So this method was devised to kind of do that. It's modeled after the HIV/AIDS activist group AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. So that's kind of cool. It has this nice social justice slant to it. It's empowering. It adds privilege and bias as a criteria. So this is kind of one of the methods that really asks students to dig into that piece. And what I also like is that it shifts away from the traditional scholarly paradigm. So as I talked about, I think with the Ingroup Bias section in my environment as an academic librarian, I face a lot of, students who are just really struggling with the idea that they can only, what is scholarly communication? What is scholarly knowledge? What is good versus bad? Why do I have to use peer-reviewed sources? And while there are many, many reasons that you should, sometimes there are sources that are just as valid and maybe more valid and more important to the research questions that people have, but they've been locked out of the scholarly paradigm due to bias, right? And so I like this method. I'll dig a little deeper and just show you, these are some of the questions that this method asks students to ask. I mean, is the information presented in a way to sway the reader? Is there a conflict of interest? It really asks students and users to kind of search who has funded the research, to find out if those funders have an interest in the outcome of the research. There have been lots of examples of industry-funded scientific research that is highly controversial. I think the sugar industry and Coca-Cola did a lot of scholarly research studies to show that, sugar is really good for you, right? We could check the motivation behind that. Are those authors affiliated with organizations that would cause a conflict of interest? And then we just need to remember, though, bias is not a bad thing if the source is explicit about their bias and their agenda. Is that happening? Are they saying what their motivations are? And then on that privilege side is something that I think is new to this way of evaluating sources, is acknowledging that there is privilege in publishing, whereby mostly white scholars and researchers can publish their research. So this is particularly significant in academic circles. Ask yourself, are they the only folks who might write or publish on this topic? Who's missing in this conversation? Take time to search for sources and authors who are not represented in the database so that your research is well-rounded and inclusive. So this kind of goes to that slide where I showed you the cite Black authors. Women also know stuff. Black women also know stuff. So kind of taking a look at where is knowledge being created outside of these traditional dominant spheres, right? So that's the ACT UP method. And I've been using it a lot. I can say in my teaching this semester, we piloted a bunch of sections for first-year undergraduate writing students. And it's really good. And it's great to see students kind of dig deeper into their research and really start asking these kinds of questions. The next method is the SIFT method. This was introduced in 2018 by Mike Caulfield at Washington State University. I could be wrong on that. It might just be Washington University, but he really created this method aimed at stopping the spread of misinformation. So this would be a great method. You may learn about it in the part 3 of the information literacy series. What I love about it is that it acknowledges that in the information ecosphere we find ourselves, there are bad actors. There are people who are intentionally creating dis, and malinformation and putting it online in order to change politics, to make money, to hurt others. So this is a strategy that kind of gives users the tools to try to see if that's actually happening in the information resource that they're looking at. So it's another acronym, S for stop, and that's encouraging when you find a resource, stop and investigate the resource. Don't read it yet, just kind of see where it's being hosted. So that's like looking at the URL, really just Googling or doing a Wikipedia search on the URL to find out who is this organization, investigating that source, and then trying to find better coverage. Is it covered somewhere else? And then tracing claims and quotes to the original context. So that's kind of seeing where has this information first appeared, because we know that stuff gets completely manipulated as it moves through time, right? So my question for this section is, have you used any of these methods in your own practice? And are there any other methods that you use that maybe I haven't heard of? So with that, I'm going to move to our last section, which is talking about the bias in information systems. In particular, we're going to look at Google and two library systems, the Dewey Decimal System and the Library of Congress subject headings. So first, I want to talk briefly about Google and its algorithm. An algorithm is a mathematical formula. It's a formula that is changing constantly, and it is used to rank the results that Google gives you in a search. We don't get to see the algorithm. We don't know what's behind it. It's changing constantly. So there's some, there's hidden bias in it, and we don't understand what that is. There's also a whole industry of people trying to take advantage of the algorithm. You've heard of search engine optimization. There are people that are designing websites and adding certain kinds of data into that website so that their search results go to the top, right? And so this algorithm is problematic. And so you may have heard about Safiya Noble's book from 2018, Algorithms of Oppression. If you haven't, I want to touch on it for a little bit because it's groundbreaking, right? It explained in vivid detail the bias that is evident in search algorithms, in particular Google's. Her research exposed some very disturbing issues with the Google search algorithm. And since her research was published, Google has addressed some of these issues, but it's important to note that these changes may not have come about were it not for her work and the work of other critical information researchers. The examples that she researched are not the only problematic examples, but I just wanted to talk about some. So if you haven't had a chance to read the book, I encourage you to check it out. And much of the content is incredibly sensitive and possibly triggering. So for the purposes of our session today, I'm going to share some of the less charged examples. So what her research focused on was Google's autocomplete function, and just the cover of her book demonstrates some very overt racism and sexism. And so just the cover shows you what happened when she searched Black women are, and its function provided largely negative terms, right? She also moved away from autocomplete and looked at what was returned in basic keyword searches on women of different ethnicities. This is one of the less offensive examples, and it shows that a search on Hispanic girls returned mostly dating sites. This sexism was consistent and often across almost all ethnicities that she Googled. She further found that whiteness was prioritized in image searches. Here's an example of what came up when she Googled doctor. And here's what came up when she Googled nurse. Right? Mostly white, mostly female, problematic, right? And again, this is all I'm going to go into with Google's algorithm, but it's there, right? So let's think about library systems. The Dewey Decimal Classification, that's what we're using in mostly public libraries, created by Melville Dewey in 1876. Melville Dewey is now known as a misogynist and sexist and racist. And so if we think about systems reflecting their creators' worldviews, we can determine that there may be some problems with the Dewey Decimal System. The same is the Library of Congress subject headings, which were created in 1897, and they're used in research and academic libraries. Both of these systems represent Anglocentric, heteronormative, patriarchal worldviews, and they're very slow to change. So, I mean, these systems are over 200 years old, or almost 200, gosh, I can't even do my math, 150 years old. And it's really hard to get changes through these. So that's just something to be aware of. So the Dewey Decimal System, just two examples of the problems within that. Homosexuality is categorized under 132. It came in 1932, and it was cataloged as a mental derangement. It also exists under 159.9 and abnormal psychology, and 363.49 as social problems. Religion. Christianity gets the entire 200 division. Other religions don't start until the 290s. And Islam, which is a widely practiced religion across the world, only gets the category 297. So, this is a good example of the othering that's happening in the Dewey Decimal System. And I think, many of us are aware of that, but it's something that I think it's good that we as library workers are aware of, and that we make transparent to those that we're working with, to those that we're educating and helping and serving, right? The Library of Congress subject headings are super problematic. There are some that have been changed, like the Vietnam conflict has now been changed and it's now called the Vietnam War. Japanese Americans, the evacuation and relocation is what they were trying to call it. And it is now, I think, correctly termed the forced removal and internment. And illegal aliens, after a years-long debate, is now non-citizens or illegal immigration, which is still problematic. But this is just the most recent example of a very highly charged debate over subject headings. And if you think about the fact that they are the Library of Congress subject headings, these changes cannot be made without congressional approval. So obviously you can see that politics are going to come into play and that the biases that are inherent in politics are going to come into play. Many more of these subject headings remain, and I would add it here on this slide a link to the cataloging lab where people can submit problem subject headings. There's a subject heading that's still on the books called problem children. We have homeless persons, and we have Oriental literature. You know, these are problematic and could be very offensive to our patrons, right? So acknowledging this, I think, is important. So search engines and information systems have their own priorities. They rank results based on personalized information. So Google is going to rank its results based on your browsing behavior. These rankings have been found to reinforce dominant perspectives. And then, like I said, catalogs and classification systems are created by individuals, and thus their structures reflect their worldviews. And if you think about any information organization process, right? The people who are creating it are not computers, right? They're humans, and humans come with their own set of biases, their own set of personal experiences, and that is unavoidably sometimes bleeds into the work that they do, right? And so it's our job as information professionals to expose that and to advocate for that and to educate and bring that to the forefront. So my last question is, have you come across examples like this in your own searching? Or maybe have you ever had a patron interaction where you've seen a problematic subject heading and had to kind of deal with that? So the last slide for today before we start talking is I just was hoping that through this presentation, just a few takeaways, and I kind of like to break things out into the skills and the dispositions or the attitudes that can help you in your work as library professionals, but also as members of an information literate society, right? So the skills is that I'm hoping you've found some strategies to circumvent these systems by seeking out alternate sources of information or going behind the subject headings and using keyword searches with a variety of terms. Think of using this in your reference interviews with patrons, encouraging them to explore many options when they're doing their searching. And then the dispositions. I hope that this inspires you to critically challenge the way that information today is presented, and to remember that tools are set up to serve the goals of the creators, and we need to push against that. Not all tools, some tools are created to do that, right? So I believe we can model critical approaches, and this gets at that myth of libraries being neutral, which is something I do not believe. I instead think it's important that we acknowledge that information systems and practices can be flawed, and we share that knowledge with our patrons and our users, and hopefully we'll be able to continue to improve things as we go. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. Thanks for having me.